Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC, and your host. There are a lot of you out there for late August. Thank you for logging on such short notice. We didn't have any advance warning of the precipitating event, but we do know where to go for useful information. We're going for both background and speculation today, and I think if you're speculating, best to do it with an expert. Our expert is Dr. Stephen Bryen. Before we go to Steve, here is your JPC commercial. We were founded in 1985 as a 501c3 organization, providing analysis of both foreign policy and defense. You can find us on our website at jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can see our insight articles and our magazine In Focus Quarterly. The summer 2023 issue is up right now, considering the impact of the Ukraine war on Chinese, Russian, and Iranian projection of power. Here at the JPC, we support a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. As an organization that stands slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, and energy security, as well as free speech and intellectual diversity. In this series of calls, we have been pleased to bring you scholars and academics on a variety of subjects, including Israel, the Abraham Accords on the plus side, Iran on the negative side. We've also done Ukraine several times, the short war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which had much bigger implications, as well as China and Turkey. Today, it's Russia, Wagner, and war. Your public service announcement, you are muted. Use the Q&A function, we're monitoring. And now our guest, Dr. Stephen Bryen. And for those of you who have asked, yes, he is my husband. And yes, he is sitting next to me on his computer, but that's not why he's here. He's here because he is an expert in security, strategy, and technology. If you read his Substack column, you also know that he spent an enormous amount of time studying the war in Ukraine, both from the Ukrainian side and the Russian side. He has held senior positions in the Department of Defense on Capitol Hill and as president of a large multinational defense and technology company. He was senior director of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee and served in the Pentagon under President Ronald Reagan as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Trade Security Policy and as the founder and first director of the Defense Technology Security Administration. Both of those are best done in acronyms. In the latter context, the late Morley Safer of CBS 60 Minutes called him the Pentagon's top cop, a man whose job it is to ensure that sensitive technology is kept from enemies, potential enemies, and questionable allies. But there are other allies, and Steve spent time as North American president of an Italian technology company, where a key part of his portfolio was managing and shepherding U.S. and allied cooperation in pursuit of our common defense. He received the highest civilian award of the Defense Department on 2 occasions. He presently writes for a variety of outlets, most of which you probably read, including the JPC, and he has written books including Technology, Security, and National Power, and Security for Holy Places. As I said, you can find him in Substack. And now, Stephen Bryen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shoshana. Well, I've been drafted into talking about what happened to the Wagner Group and, of course, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group. And as everyone knows by now, an airplane carrying Prigozhin, or allegedly carrying Prigozhin, and other members of the Wagner Group crashed yesterday in a region about 100 miles northwest of Moscow. The plane was flying from Shrapnel Airport in Moscow and heading for St. Petersburg. It had been airborne less than 10 minutes when it crashed. So let's take a look at some of the factors involved. And for that, I very quickly prepared, I might say, a PowerPoint presentation. So let me switch to that now, if I may. And that will take a little bit of artistic work on my part. Here we go. First of all, let's talk about the Wagner Group itself. I think it's important to understand. Wagner Group, essentially, it was a private military organization. The words private should be put in quotations, because while it was officially non-recognized by the Russian government, it worked directly for the Russian government most of the time. It was founded in 2014, so it's been around for a while. And of course, it played a huge role, particularly in Ukraine, and there, especially in the vital battle over Bakhmut. And Bakhmut is a town in right on the border between Lugansk and Donetsk regions, a very critical area, one where major battles were fought over, I think, 9 months, and largely the ground force deployed there was Wagner forces. The Wagner forces, as you can see by the numbers below, grew very rapidly until December 2022, when it was up to about 50,000 men. Most of those men were either volunteers or were prisoners who were offered an opportunity to serve in Wagner in exchange for having their sentences in prison removed. And so that's what they did. They suffered large casualties in the battles, but they prevailed, and they were able to drive out much larger Ukrainian forces, and they were fierce, a dangerous competitor. Wagner is active in many places today, no longer in Ukraine after the revolt back in June, which we'll talk about in a minute, but it's active in Africa, in Mali, for example, in Central African Republic, in Libya, and other places. It is active in Belarus, although that's disbanding now. We'll come and talk about that in a minute. And its future role inside for Russia is still a little bit up in the air. We'll talk about that too. Prigozhin and his co-founder, actually the real founder, Dmitry Utkin, were allegedly killed in the plane crash yesterday. I believe they were, by the way, just to cut to the chase here. The bodies have all been recovered, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. The last time we heard from Prigozhin, there he is, was yesterday, was day before yesterday, I'm sorry, in this, in a video. This is a screenshot from the video, probably taken in Africa. It's all about Africa. That's what he spoke about, where he said that he was going to create a new Africa on behalf of Russia and do all these great things. He then flew back to Moscow, where he is on his own private airplane, the one that crashed yesterday. And the plane was supposed to then proceed to St. Petersburg. The man with him, but let me talk just a minute before I switch to Utkin. A few things to know about Prigozhin. He comes from a family that's partially Jewish. His father was Jewish, his grandfather was Jewish, and his stepfather was Jewish. Judaism played no particular role in his life, but it's interesting that he grew up in that environment, and he grew up in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, and that's where he became, let's say, a criminal. I think that's a fair way to put it. He was arrested for theft. He spent 9 of 12 years behind bars, and he was released from jail in 1990. Then he founded a food business, actually a hot dog seller, where he made a lot of money, and then grew that into a catering company and grew that into an empire through acquisitions, through corruption, through many things. He was a pal of Vladimir Putin, who also comes from the same place. They cooperated together on many things. and basically Prigozhin's power came from Putin. Otherwise, he wouldn't have survived. Now, let's talk a minute about the real founder of the Wagner Group. His name was Dmitry Utkin. He also was killed in the plane crash yesterday. He comes from the GRU, which is Russia's military intelligence arm. And he was a special forces guy, known as Spetsnaz in Russian terms. A very ruthless fellow who greatly admired the Nazis. And that's why he chose the name Wagner, the great German composer, also an anti-Semite. But now it looks like Colonel General Mizintsev, I hope I pronounce it correctly, who was not on the plane and is still around, is now regarded as the current leader of Wagner. There's been speculation about what's going to happen to Wagner. We really don't know, but Mizintsev is, at least for now, is heading it. And if he can keep it together, it will continue operating as a private organization working directly for the GRU and working directly for the Russian government. One other thing to report, as you may know, after the June revolt, the June 23rd revolt by the Wagner forces marching on Moscow, and the settlement of that, the deal, Putin offered Wagner two choices. You can either go to Belarus in exile and help the Belarusian government, or you can join the regular Russian army and become a part of the army. But those were the choices. As far as I know, none of them actually joined the Russian army. They went to Belarus. On the left in this photo that you're looking at, you can see the huge base that was built for them. This is from January 2023. And then on the right, you can see that the base is being dismantled as of yesterday. So it looks like the Belarus adventure is over for all intents and purposes. Now, the plane that crashed was an Embraer 600. And with the tail number, or the registration number, I should say, RA 02795. According to the Russian aviation authorities, this is the passenger list. Of the list, you can see Prighozin, you can see Utkin, and the other one of considerable importance, Chekalov, who's the big logistics guy for the Wagner Group, plus the crew, the pilot, the co-pilot, of course, and a lady flight attendant. This is the airplane itself, and you can see the registration number clearly painted on the left engine of the aircraft. This is a screenshot of a video that was made in the village where the plane crashed by a lady who heard the explosion and then grabbed her phone and actually got video of the plane falling from the sky. A couple of interesting things. Observers say that one wing was blown off, the tail was blown off, and the plane tried to gain altitude, could not, and then spiraled to the ground. There's the tail section of the plane. It landed about 2 miles from where the fuselage of the plane crashed. So you can see the tail section's in pretty much good shape. It really was singed in the back. If you look at the back, you'll see carbonization, but the rest of it's clean. And this is the actual crash site of the main body of the plane. It's pretty well decimated by the crash and the fire. And here we see another view where rescuers, first responders, are removing bodies from the aircraft. All the bodies have been recovered as far as I know, and they've been taken to a mortuary nearby. Now, this is an interesting photo. This probably is part of the wing section, but it isn't clear whether this is the wing section that broke off or whether this is the wing section of the crashed plane. I suspect it's part of the wing section that broke off. And you can see what looks like shrapnel. And that's what the red circles are are showing shrapnel that penetrated the wing. That's important because there's debate about what happened to this airplane and why it crashed. There are two versions out there. One is it was hit by ground-to-air missiles. The other is that there was an explosion on board the airplane that blew it up. You wouldn't get shrapnel on the wing if it was an explosion inside the airplane. You would get shrapnel from an air defense. Air defense missiles typically have what are called fragmentation warheads. That is, when they strike the target, they strike it by throwing out a blast of fragments, usually made out of zirconium or hardened steel, which are designed to tear up the airplane. It looks like the airplane was hit on the right engine, not the left, which also blew off the wing and severed the tail section. It doesn't look like it was blown up by a bomb, but that's my impression. Not everyone would agree with that. There is a big rumor going around that an investigation has been started and that this fellow, Artem Stepanov, who was the owner of the aircraft company and therefore the owner of the aircraft, but it was a Wagner company, who had been around the plane before it took off, but then he himself took a plane to the Kamchatka Peninsula and since has disappeared. And the rumor is that he planted the explosive in the landing gear of the airplane. An investigation has been launched. We don't know yet the outcome of that investigation, or even if it's a legitimate argument, but that's being put out. I think it's being put out to deflect, this is my opinion again, to deflect from the notion that a Russian air defense system shot down the plane. Now, another point arises that needs to be talked about. Who has air defense systems in Russia? So the plane was flying at level 27, which means 28, I'm sorry, level 28, which means it was at 28,000 feet and still climbing when it was hit. 28,000 feet means that a shoulder-fired missile, like an Igla, for example, or a Verba, these are two Russian-made man-pads, man-held anti-aircraft weapons. They're rockets or missiles. That's too high for them, so it couldn't have been that. So it would have had to have been a ground-in-place anti-aircraft system. Who has them? Well, obviously the Russian army has them and could use them, but that's very complicated to think that one of those deployments, and there were SS-20 deployed in that region, could have been the one that took it out. However, the GRU has them too. And probably, at least my speculation is, if this was an assassination, it was done by the GRU, who wanted to get back control over Wagner, take it away from Prigozhin and Utkin, and put it in more reliable hands. This would be my interpretation of what happened, but we can discuss it. Of course, at the time of the shoot down or explosion or whatever you want to call it, the crash, Putin himself was in Kursk celebrating the anniversary, the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Kursk, a critical battle in World War II. If Stalingrad showed that the Russians could resist and stop the German army, Kursk showed that the Russian army could advance against the Nazis and start its march eventually to Berlin. This was a very critical battle, one of the most important battles of the time. So that's where Putin was. He was rushed back to Moscow after the ceremonies. We have video of him arriving at the Kremlin at high speed. And beyond that, we know nothing at all about his activity, involvement, or anything. There's an argument that he did it. It was his plan to do it. That may not necessarily be the case. There are plenty of reasons why the GRU might want to do it, as opposed to to Putin, who had promised to protect Prigozhin. So I'm not convinced it was Putin who actually carried this thing out. It could very well have been the GRU leadership wanting to get control. Prigozhin was a bit of a strange guy and very independent-minded. He obviously took on the Russian army leadership and the defense ministry. Actually brought his soldiers into Rostov-on-Don and then marched toward Moscow. And it took Lukashenko in Belarus and Putin to talk him out of it. And they made guarantees. And one of the things Bill Clinton has said about Putin is he keeps his promises. Whether you may not like what he does, but he keeps his promises. So if he promised to protect Prigozhin, he probably tried to. At least that's one interpretation we could take. And that getting rid of Prigozhin was an imperative for GRU, but not necessarily for Putin. This is my argument. But I'll be happy to take your questions. That's a brief introduction to how I see it and what the situation looks like.
Turn off your screen. Thank you. We have questions, but you answered most. Oh, okay. I'm going to a question you didn't answer. If their leader is dead, how likely is it that other Wagner forces are going to follow a new Kremlin-approved leader? Can the organization be integrated forcibly into the Russian military, or do they have to get rid of more people?
Well, a lot of that depends on whether they accept Mitsinov as their new commander. I mean, he has a record, but there's something about Mitsinov. It may be of interest. He's a colonel general in the Russian army, who was dismissed by Putin along with other Russian generals because of the performance in Ukraine in the first half of the war, let's call it the first 6 months of the war. And he was assigned to Wagner, as was Surovikin, another colonel general assigned to Wagner. Now, Surovikin was arrested after the June 23rd revolt and hadn't been seen since. Not clear what his status is. Yesterday, it was said before the crash that he had been relieved of his duties in the army, but he hadn't been performing them anyway. His daughter said he'd been under some sort of house arrest. But Surovikin may yet reemerge, we don't know. But maybe even in Wagner, it's possible. But I doubt it. I think that Mitsinov is the guy who is closest to what the GRU would want and what the Kremlin would accept. So the long answer to your short question is maybe they will accept this new leadership, and maybe they will continue to operate as they operated before. There's been a lot of stories, let's call them stories, and quoting various Wagner people. We're going to get our revenge. We're not going to allow that sort of thing. We're going to march on Moscow, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's mostly smoke and not real. And I suspect that when this settles down, they're not going to have much choice.
Okay. You raised an interesting possibility that other people have not yet raised, which is that it wasn't Putin who did it. And since we asked you to come here and speculate, I think that's great speculation. But whether he did or he didn't, this will have implications for his future control on things. If he did it and it works and Wagner's absorbed, that seems to make Putin look better. If he didn't do it, that could undermine the rest of his reign, administration, or whatever you want to call it. So how do you see the future of Putin if you raise that speculation that he didn't order it?
Well, my initial take on it was this was going to help Putin because Prigozhin was a nemesis for Putin and someone that he really was having difficulty with. And of course, he embarrassed Putin greatly through the revolt and the March on Washington and lowered his stature considerably on Moscow, sorry, and lowered his stature significantly, which he's regained. I mean, be honest about it. Putin has survived that fairly well. But if it's true, as I think it might be, that it wasn't him that ordered this, he has to watch his back because he flies in airplanes too. So he has to be careful. I mean, Russia's a very funny place. It's not it's not normal, whatever we call normal. It's not normal. It's Russia. It operates in a different way. And the long knives could be out on Putin just as well as anyone else. The problem is there's no immediate successor to Putin that anyone knows about. So they have to invent one. And I don't see that yet. I mean, they didn't seek to embarrass Putin. They just sought to get rid of Prigozhin.
So this leads us to a question from a listener. You mentioned the GRU. Would you please explain again what the GRU is and why they might do something that Putin didn't ask them to do?
Well, the GRU is the Russian military intelligence organization. It's very powerful, much more powerful than the non-military intelligence, which is now called the FSB. It's the old KGB. But even in the Soviet days, you had KGB and you had GRU. The GRU also has an army. It's not just guys, doing analysis or figuring out what military, like our DIA, we have something called Defense Intelligence Agency, which primarily studies the other guys, the enemy, and looks at their weapons, looks at their troop forming, that kind of thing, analytical. GRU is operational and analytical. And operationally, it runs what's called Spetsnaz forces, which are essentially special operations forces. Something like our SEAL Team 6, except multiplied by 100. It's big. And it's a powerful force inside of Russia.
Thank you. Question. Could a drone and or Ukraine, I think meaning Ukrainian drone, have been responsible for the crash? Do the Ukrainians have that kind of capability?
The short answer is no. A drone can't fly at those altitudes. Simple as that. And anyway, how would you get a drone to crash into an airplane? It's a jet airplane. That's a hard thing. There are drones that may be equipped with air-to-air missiles, but I don't think Ukraine has any. And in any case, the Ukrainians are going out of their way today to say they had nothing to do with this. Leave us alone. We didn't do it. Sometimes it's true and sometimes isn't. But I think in the current circumstances, we can say that this was internal to Russia, had nothing to do with Ukraine.
A question from a listener. Is a response by the United States, either by President Biden or by the State Department or by the Defense, is a response required from the United States, or should we just keep our mouths shut?
Well, I don't think the United States can say anything, because what we would say, Prigozhin got killed. Too bad. We didn't like him anyway. I think they came kind of close. The president said, saying, well, maybe Putin did it, that kind of thing. I think you have to be really careful about that. And that's why I've offered an alternative theory. First, because I don't believe he did. And secondly, by accusing him of that, in a way, you strengthen him. So why do that?
Okay, so one way or the other, the war in Ukraine continues. You mentioned that Wagner and Prigozhin's troops were shoring up the Russian effort until the march on Moscow, and now they're not there anymore. So what has that meant for the trajectory of the war? And does it mean anything different if the Wagner forces come under new leadership and get sent back to Ukraine? How do you see this impacting the war?
I think it's very unlikely, first of all, that they'll be sent back to Ukraine under any circumstances. They don't need them. the Russian army has been significantly operationally expanded. They have around 250 to 350,000 reserves that they've been training up. So if they commit those in any way to the Ukraine war, it will be decisive. But right now, they have around 100,000 soldiers in Ukraine, maybe a little more. So no, they don't need Wagner for anything. And I don't think there's any likelihood that they'll use them for that again. It doesn't make any sense.
Sorry, I was muted for a second. Could you add on to that? Okay, so the Russians are there, they've got the troops, they've sort of revamped their position. The Ukrainians have absorbed a bunch of American and Western equipment, kind of revamped theirs. There are big stakes here for the United States outside of Ukraine. Do you see any of this threatening Poland? Belarus and Poland have been a little bit nasty with each other lately. And do you think that, how do you think the war is actually going to go? It's one thing to say the Russian troops are advanced and improved and that the Ukrainian troops are advanced and improved, but how's it going?
I think on the ground, the Russians are starting to win. They have stopped, for the most part, the Ukrainian counteroffensive. They have cost the Ukrainians a huge amount of troops and equipment, including a lot of Western equipment being destroyed that didn't perform up to snuff, so to speak. They have in the northeast an offensive underway, a light offensive, I'd call it. But it's toward Kupiansk, which could turn into something even bigger if they commit those 100,000 extra troops they have hanging around. So the Russians are in pretty good shape, I think, in the war compared to the Ukrainians, who are getting bled in terms of manpower, especially. It's very tough on them. Now, turning to Belarus and the situation with Poland, which is nasty. If I were Polish, I would be fairly happy that the Wagner guys are out of there. I mean, that's a benefit to them. I think they're much better soldiers than the Belarusian, I guess you would say, army, which is poorly trained and which the Wagners were supposedly training. So if they were training them, they weren't very good. That's my opinion. So no, I think that may have taken the pressure off of Poland. Although you never know. The Poles have their own ambitions. Let's be honest about it. And part of it's not only Belarus, but it's the Western Ukraine, up including Lviv, where they would like to have it. And if for some reason the Ukrainian government collapses, I wouldn't be surprised to see the Polish army move in and to grab that area. And I don't think the Russians will do much about it. Now, exactly what's going to happen in Ukraine is still up in the air, of course. But I think it's reaching a point where we might get some decisive outcome, maybe in late fall, early winter.
I'm going to ask you about decisive outcomes. The Biden administration, though, two questions in one here. Since the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was bloody, ugly, and not well handled at all, there have been people who say that event encouraged the enemies of the United States. Yes, for sure, the Taliban and ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Do we have to be seen as succeeding in Ukraine, meaning our proxy in Ukraine, in order to strengthen our own American deterrence? That's one. And number two, the administration's been accused of sort of slow walking equipment to Ukraine, and that benefits the Russians. How do those two things square? We slow walk the equipment and it doesn't help us look very good. Now what? Now what?
Well, let's go backwards. In terms of slow walking, I don't agree with that at all. We're putting a huge amount of ammunition and equipment into Ukraine, but some of it wasn't ready. Some of it doesn't exist, has to be manufactured. So no, we're not slow walking it at all. Billions and billions of dollars. The amount of money that's gone into Ukraine is staggering compared to any other venture we've had in modern times. So I don't agree with slow walking, not at all. Biden administration, in answer to the first question, the deterrence. I mean, some people can argue that by shipping all this equipment to Ukraine, where it's burned up in days, leaves us naked, leaves us unable to fulfill our obligations to NATO or in the Pacific. We don't have the guns. So that's the negative. Now, I don't think that necessarily is driving Biden decision makers on Ukraine. I think they made a commitment to it. They're doing whatever they can to win, but it's looking more and more like not going to win, and that some negotiation is going to be needed sooner rather than later, because the longer it takes, the more territory the Russians will gobble up, and then where are you? So I think they need to negotiate a deal. There's no sign of that. Unfortunately, the administration was, I think they were hoping that the counteroffensive by Ukraine would create conditions where they thought they could get back a lot of what they lost and make a deal with the Russians. That didn't happen, but it's going to get worse now. So I think that we're at a point where it would be wise for the United States, and probably very wise for Zelensky and his government, to try negotiating a deal with the Russians. The Russians want one. They don't want to keep this up. But by the same token, their position is getting to be more and more awkward and more difficult as they lose manpower and they lose equipment and they lose territory. So that's essentially where we're at.
The Biden administration, however, hasn't seemed terribly interested in one of two things: either announcing an American endgame for Ukraine, something that we would like to see, and hasn't been very successful in pushing Zelensky toward negotiation, even before the invasion, during the invasion, throughout the invasion. How much leverage do we have? We keep giving him stuff and he keeps hanging out, and we don't seem to have an end game.
Well, I think the opposite's the case. I mean, we encouraged him not to negotiate. We talked him out of doing any deals with the Russians. In fact, we were bitterly complaining to him, don't do that. So the talks with the Turks, for example, which showed some promise, were canceled because the Ukrainians were told to get out of there. I think it's all from the United States. If you want us to keep supporting you, then you can't negotiate with the Russians. But I think that's starting to change for some very profound reasons. First of all, the U.S. intelligence community is finally telling the truth to the Biden administration people, that they're getting clobbered, that this whole offensive failed. That's not me saying so. That's the Washington Post and the New York Times who are reporting what the U.S. intelligence community is saying. So if the U.S. intelligence community has a consensus position that this counteroffensive has failed, then it's time to wrap it up. By the way, speaking of that, there's a lot of the U.S. is saying that Zelensky is not following the things we suggested, and the Ukrainians are saying the U.S. is giving us bad advice. This is all part of the fallout of a bad policy. And I think what we're going to see is once it settles down, and it won't be very much longer, that they're going to have to try to open up negotiation. And I think they will.
So there was a great book called Every War Must End, written by the late, great Freddie Clay. And Every War Must End posits that, yes, it does, either with a victory for one side and a defeat for the other, or war can grind on until it loses public support. And it eventually just kind of pull out and go away and go home, which is essentially what we did in Vietnam. It's essentially what we did in Afghanistan. Is that what it's going to look like if we go to negotiations? Are we going to look as if we have just decided it's not worth it and we're pulling?
Well, I think possibly that's the case, but I wouldn't be too sure. Right now, the polls show that about 60% of the Americans don't want to send arms anymore to Ukraine. They don't want to spend any more money on Ukraine. That's polls. You can decide whether they mean anything or not. But there's frustration with the whole thing. We haven't done well. It's costing an awful lot of lives. We're burning up too many soldiers, not ours, but theirs. And it's not going anywhere. So yeah, maybe that's how it will end, with a whimper, not a bang. I don't know, but it needs to be sorted out. I don't think that a good negotiation, whatever good means, a good negotiation is necessarily a negative thing, even for the war hawks in Washington right now. I mean, it's better to settle it and say, okay, we won, declare victory and leave, to George Aiken's famous statement. And I have to say something about Freddie Clay, because he was my boss in the Pentagon. He was a wonderful man, a brilliant man, highly respected. And, when he walked into the White House, the president listened because he knew Fred spoke only the truth. So Fred's book is a classic. Everyone should read it. I think it's in its 6th edition now, something like that. But it's, the war must end. That's my opinion.
And if you don't buy the book, check our website, because in a couple of days, I reviewed the book and I wrote about it. I'm going to repost that, because I think as the war in Ukraine comes to some sort of conclusion, some fashion, what he said was very important, how you get out and what happens if you negotiate your way out. Last question, and I think this comes from the conversation we just had. Someone just sent in, is there any connection between the Biden administration's policies and perhaps Biden administration's increasing interest in negotiations as time goes on to the incarcerated Wall Street Journal reporter in Moscow? Is it possible that there's some quid pro quo here?
Hard to say. I mean, I think there's reason to negotiate with the Russians on prisoner exchanges. I guess we won't give the Russians $8 billion or whatever $1 billion we gave to the Iranians for nothing. But yeah, I mean, it's possible. By the way, the Wall Street guy, I forgot his name, his detention was extended by 3 months today. So yeah, I mean, the Russians are playing it for all it's worth, as you would expect them to. It's not good news for journalists in Russia, because it's a very dangerous place for them. I think the Russians are unwise on this one, very unwise. It does not serve their interests very well to imprison the Wall Street Journal reporter, whether on sound or non-sound grounds, it doesn't matter. If they wanted to throw him out of the country, they could have done that without any difficulty. So this is a very stupid move by the Russians, and it doesn't bode well for them. They have to straighten their act out.
So his name is Evan Gershkovich,
right.
And I just think we should say his name, So we're come sort of to the end of the program, and people who tune in know that I generally ask speakers to leave us with a positive note. I'm not sure there's a positive note in anything you've given us. So here's my dilemma. Do I change my method of operation and not ask you for one? Or do I ask you for a positive note and have you tell me there isn't one? Your call.
Well, when people die, it's not a positive note. It's hard to figure out how to make it positive. I think we could say that what's curious or unknown for both is that what's going to happen with the Russian leadership is still very much undecided. The liquidation, if you want to call it that, of Prighozhin and the others, is evidence of that. And my opinion is correct that it was the GRU that did it, not Putin. It's even more complex and difficult. So we're not out of the woods yet at all in regard to the Russian leadership, nor is Putin. And so that's not a positive note. That's just an honest description.
Okay, so without a positive note, but with an awful lot of excellent information and speculation, I think you've left us better off as we read the newspapers and we try to follow the footsteps of people who investigate. And for that, I thank you. That was a really important thing to parse, and we'll decide later if you're right or you're wrong in your speculation. But it was a really great thing to have for us. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you, Stephen Bryen, for an outstanding performance.